The video you watched before this one told you that August heat makes catfish feed harder. That part is close enough to true. Warm water speeds up a cold-blooded animal, and a faster engine burns more fuel. But nobody in that video mentioned the second dial the heat turns up. And this one turns against you. In 2009, Lydia Wysocki and her colleagues, working with Arthur Popper at the University of Maryland, ran channel catfish through hearing tests at different water temperatures. They raised the water from 64 degrees Fahrenheit to 79. The fish's hearing threshold at 4,000 Hz improved by 23 decibels. 23 decibels is not a rounding error. In sound pressure terms, that is roughly a 14-fold difference. A sound the fish could barely register in cool water becomes plain and obvious in warm water. Better than 2 decibels of improvement for every single degree Celsius. Their study stopped at 79 degrees. Your August lake is hotter than that, and I am not going to hand you a number nobody measured. What the data gives us is a direction, and the direction is steep. So the honest version of that other title is this. The heat makes them feed harder. The heat also makes them hear harder. And one of those two facts gets sold to you every August. The other has never once had a price tag on it. Ask yourself why. A bait can be bottled, branded, and put back on the shelf next spring at $1 more. Silence cannot. No aisle, no patent, no seasonal refresh. So it never gets talked about, and every August a few million anglers pay for it without ever seeing the bill. Here are 15 sounds that decide your August night. 6 of them are quietly costing you fish, 5 are fine print almost nobody reads, and the last 4 can work in your favor. One of the 15 is something the tackle industry will happily sell you for $30. It is also the least proven item on this entire list. That is number 2, and when we get there I will give you the truth instead of the sales pitch. First, the animal. Because a catfish ear is not built like the ear of anything else you fish for. In 1819, a German anatomist named Ernst Weber opened up a European Wells catfish and found something odd. A chain of tiny bones ran from the swim bladder forward to the inner ear. Weber said the swim bladder was working as an eardrum, and those little bones were carrying the vibration inward, the same way the bones in your own head do. He was right, and nobody could prove it for 100 years. When the proof finally came, it came from a catfish with a name. In 1923, a young Austrian biologist was keeping a brown bullhead in a tank. He called the fish Xaverl. Every time he fed it, he whistled first. After enough repetitions, he stopped bringing food and simply whistled. The bullhead came up anyway. That biologist was Carl von Frisch. 50 years later, he would win a Nobel Prize for decoding the dance language of honeybees. But the argument he settled first was whether a fish can hear at all, and the animal that settled it was a bullhead, a North American catfish. Same family as the channel cat holding on your ledge tonight. Those bones carry Weber's name now, the Weberian ossicles. Catfish and minnows have them. Bass, pike, walleye, trout, and eel do not. Friedrich Ladich at the University of Vienna, who has spent a career on this question, wrote in a 2023 review that catfishes have the most elaborate hearing adaptations found in any group of bony fishes. The measured range runs from about 50 Hz up to 5,000 or 6,000 Hz. That upper end matters more than it sounds like it should. That is where metal touching metal lives. That is where a cooler lid lives. That is where a hook rattling loose in a plastic tray lives. You have been fishing for the sharpest set of ears in your lake and treating that fish like it is deaf. Number 15. The cooler lid. Not the cooler, the lid. Hard plastic slammed onto a hard rim, sitting on an aluminum floor or a concrete bank. Short, broadband, and a huge share of its energy sits exactly where a catfish hears best. I have watched anglers spend $40 a trip on premium bait and then announce their arrival 11 times an hour with a piece of plastic that cost them nothing. The fix cost nothing either. A strip of closed cell foam weather stripping on the rim, $2 at a hardware store. Or set the lid down instead of dropping it. That is the whole repair. Nobody is going to run an ad campaign for foam tape. Number 14. Anything dropped on the floor of the boat. A sinker, a pair of pliers, a tackle tray. Here is the part that gets missed. On land, a dropped weight makes a small noise. In a boat, the hull is a large, thin panel in direct contact with the water. Drop something on it, and the whole panel flexes and pushes that energy straight into the water column. Think about the difference between tapping a table and tapping a drumhead. Same tap, completely different result. Your boat floor is the drumhead, and the fish are on the other side of it. Aluminum is the worst offender because it is thin, stiff, and barely damped. Fiberglass is better. If you fish aluminum, an old bath mat or a scrap of carpet on the deck is one of the highest value changes you can make to a boat, and it will never appear in a brochure. Number 13. The anchor. This is the loudest, deliberate act most anglers perform, and we perform it directly on top of the fish we came for. Chain paying out over a metal bow roller, fluke slamming into rock or shell, rod snapping tight and vibrating like a bass string. All of it at the exact spot you intend to fish for the next 3 hours. The fix is not a better anchor, it is sequence. Set up current or upwind of the target and let the boat swing back down onto it, so the noise and the fish are never in the same place. Feed the rod by hand instead of letting the chain run. Wrap the last 3 feet of chain in an old bicycle inner tube, and then wait, because that is number 1 on this list and I am not giving it away yet. Number 12. Everything you drag on the bank. Chair legs, a 5-gallon bucket, boot heels on riprap or a concrete ramp. Bank anglers assume they are safe because they are not in a boat. They are standing on the same rock and packed clay that forms the bottom of the hole, and hard structure carries a knock a long way before it ever has to become a sound in the water. Riprap is the worst case. Those rocks are locked together and they run straight into the water. A steel chair leg scraping across them is an efficient way to tell every fish in front of you exactly where you are standing. Lift the chair, do not drag it. Set the bucket down, do not drop it. And if you fish riprap, walk in on the dirt above the rock line when you can. None of that costs $1. Number 11. Metal on metal at the rod. The rod butt tapped into an aluminum holder. A bank stick driven with a hammer. Snap swivels and hooks clinking in an open tray while you rummage for a leader. These are small sounds, and that is exactly why they get ignored. But small and high-pitched is the worst possible combination, because the upper part of a catfish's hearing range is the part the Weberian ossicles are built to serve. Laddich's work is clear on this. Species with big swim bladders and a full chain of ossicles hear best above 1,000 Hz. And the channel catfish is one of the sharpest that has been tested. A rubber crutch tip on the butt of every rod. Cheap, effective, completely unmarketable. Number 10, and this is the one that will surprise the experienced guys. The generator, the aerator, the live well pump, the bilge that kicks on every 11 minutes all night long. Everything so far has been a bang. This is not a bang. This is a hum. And a hum does something entirely different, and worse. Laddich's review lays it out. Sustained noise above 150 decibels can push a catfish's hearing threshold up temporarily, and it takes days to come back. But you do not need anything close to that level to hurt yourself. Low-level noise reduces hearing through masking. No injury at all. The fish's ears work fine. It simply cannot pick your signal out of the background anymore. Think about trying to hear someone say your name across a crowded bar. Nobody damaged your ears. The room is just full. Now put that against the rest of your August plan. You brought fresh bait so the scent trail would pull fish from a distance. You set up on a current seam so the trail would carry. And then you ran a continuous noise source all night that filled the room those fish were listening in. A catfish coming up a scent plume is not navigating on smell alone. It is assembling a picture. Take the sound half away and you have made yourself harder to find, not easier. Run the aerator on a timer. Kill the generator once camp is set. Put a scrap of foam under the pump so it is not bolted straight to the hull. Nobody sells that. Number 9. The trolling motor. This one is more complicated than the internet says, and I would rather give you the complication than a slogan. A trolling motor at a steady setting is tonal, continuous, and largely predictable. Fish habituate to predictable sound. That is a well-established behavioral fact, and it is why the trolling motor is not the fish killer anglers on forums claim it is. What fish do not habituate to is change. The abrupt start, the sudden speed jump, the reverse. Sharp changes are what a startle response is built to catch, because in nature, a sudden change means something just moved. So the discipline is not to leave the motor off, it is to be boring with it. Ease the speed up and down, instead of stabbing it. Stay off the high settings inside casting range. Same motor, same battery, different result. Number 8. 2-stroke versus 4-stroke. This one comes with a disclosure attached, and I will give you the disclosure before the finding. The best controlled work comparing outboard types was done on coral reef fish, not on catfish. Those studies found that 2-stroke and 4-stroke outboards produce measurably different sound spectra, and that 2-stroke noise caused significantly larger behavioral effects. In some of that work, fish under 2-stroke noise failed to respond correctly to alarm cues they normally react to instantly. A damselfish is not a channel cat, and I am not going to tell you a reef study proves anything about your reservoir. What I will tell you is that closer to home, a team at Carleton University led by Stephen Cook tested motorboat noise on nesting smallmouth bass at distances from about 15 feet out to nearly 300, and the distance between the noise and the fish changed the fish's behavior in measurable ways. So the honest summary: engine noise reaches freshwater fish, it changes what they do, and distance matters. The 2-stroke penalty is real where it has been tested and a reasonable suspicion elsewhere. Anybody telling you more than that is guessing out loud. Number 7. And this one changes the rules depending on where you are standing. Water depth decides which sounds can even travel. A sound wave cannot propagate in a layer of water thinner than its own wavelength. Shallow water acts like a filter that throws away the low notes and keeps the high ones. This has been measured directly in a freshwater pond by Forrest, Miller, and Zagar, and the effect is not subtle. The difference between a frequency that fits the depth and one that does not can run 30 to 60 decibels. In practice, in about 3 feet of water, sound below roughly 1,000 hertz struggles to go anywhere at all. In 25 feet, that same low frequency travels beautifully. So the rules invert on you. If you are on a shallow flat in 2 or 3 feet, your heavy low thumps radiate poorly through the water column, and what reaches the fish is the high-pitched material. The clink, the scrape, the rattle, those are the ones to kill. If you are anchored over a 25-foot hole or sitting in a tailwater trough, the low-frequency stuff is exactly what carries, and the anchor and the dropped weight become your biggest liabilities. One more thing about shallow water. When the water column will not carry a low frequency, the bank still will. A heavy footfall on packed clay travels through the ground. That is why the bank angler who walks softly on a 2-foot flat is not being superstitious. I have never seen depth and noise discussed together in a fishing video, and it is one of the few things on this list that changes what you do in the next 10 minutes. Number 6. And this is where some of you are going to disagree with me, which is fine, because I would rather be argued with than repeated. Talking and music. Every one of us was taught to keep our voices down on the water. Your father said it, mine did too. The physics mostly disagrees. Air and water are wildly different materials for carrying sound. When a sound wave in air hits a water surface, the overwhelming majority of that energy bounces straight back off. It never gets in. There is a narrow cone directly beneath the source, where some does penetrate. But for a conversation happening in a boat or on a bank, most of your voice is going up and sideways into the sky, not down into the hole. So no, talking at a normal volume is not what killed your bite. Here is the part that keeps this from being permission. The instant that sound source is physically touching something that touches the water, everything changes. A speaker sitting on the deck is not making an airborne sound anymore. It is vibrating the hull directly, and the hull is a drumhead, and we covered what that does. Same speaker, same volume. On a bank chair on dirt, 3 feet back from the edge, different animal entirely. So the rule is not quiet voices. The rule is that nothing which vibrates touches anything that touches the water. Tell me in the comments whether you buy that, because I know what the old boys on my bank would say about it, and I am not sure the physics cares. Number 5. The fish already in your boat. This is the strangest thing on the list, and I want to be careful about what is proven and what is not. Catfish make noise, not incidentally. They have a dedicated instrument for it. Michael Fine at Virginia Commonwealth University worked out the mechanism. A catfish's pectoral spine has a ridged process at its base that rides in a groove in the shoulder girdle. When the fish sweeps that fin, the ridges catch and release against the rough surface. Fine's group described it as a stick-and-slip mechanism, the same physics as a violin bow dragging across a string. That is a channel catfish. That is a blue catfish. They both do it, and they do it hardest when they are frightened. Fine's group showed something else. When a largemouth bass takes a channel catfish tail first, the catfish stridulates, and across repeated trials, those bass learned. They struck the catfish with clipped spines more often and ate them. And Ladich's work shows that a catfish's own auditory pathway encodes the fine timing pattern of those pulses. The information is getting through. So every catfish you land is broadcasting a distress signal in a band its own species hears extremely well, while you unhook it over an aluminum floor. Now the honest part. Nobody has demonstrated that this empties a hole. It is a reasonable suspicion built on solid pieces. It is not a proven fact, and I will not sell it to you as one. But it is free to test, and that test is more fun than watching a rod tip. 2 nights, same stretch, same bait. Night 1. Every fish you keep goes straight up onto the bank away from the water. Night 2. They go into a mesh basket in the water, right beside your rods. Log the gap between bites both nights. Nobody funded that experiment, and nobody can sell it to you. The comment section on this video is going to be a better data set on it than anything I could produce alone. Post your numbers. Number 4. Now we flip to the sounds that work for you, starting with one you are already making and getting wrong. The sound of your bait hitting the water. Every cast is an acoustic event whether you planned it or not. A flat cast that lands sideways with a hard slap is a broad, sharp, high-energy noise directly over the spot. A cast that enters at a steeper angle, rod tip dropped and spool feathered at the last second, goes in far more cleanly. That is worth real money on a shallow flat, where the fish are sitting in inches of water and high frequencies are the ones that travel. But there is a second half, and it is the interesting half. A soft, repeated plop is not an alarm signal. It is what falling food sounds like. Shad flick. Insects fall. Mulberries drop off a limb into the water in midsummer, and fish absolutely key on it. So instead of chumming silently, chum audibly. Small handfuls, dropped in a steady rhythm, at the head of the current seam, 5 or 6 minutes before your bait goes in. Same chum, same cost. You have added a channel of information the fish is exceptionally well equipped to receive. Check your state and local regulations before you chum anything. Rules on chumming and baiting vary enormously between states and between individual waters, and some places prohibit it outright. Number 3. The clonk. There is a wooden tool, roughly the shape of a hammer with a hollowed cup on the face, that European anglers have used on Wells catfish for well over a century. You strike it on the surface with a specific wrist snap. The cup traps and releases an air pocket, and it makes a sound people describe as a cork coming out of a bottle. They call it clonking. It is a serious technique over there, and a large share of those enormous Wells catfish you have seen on the internet were caught by anglers doing it. It is crossing the Atlantic now. Outdoor Life ran a piece on it earlier this year, and one of the anglers they spoke to is Jackie Kennedy, an East Texas guide who has used a clonk extensively on flatheads. Here is my honest read. The biology says catfish hear well enough for this to be plausible. The history says a lot of people who fish very hard for a living believe in it. The evidence says nobody has run a proper controlled trial. Reports are mixed, and there are experienced clonkers in Europe who say that on pressured water the sound can spook a big fish rather than call it. Plausible, traditional, unproven, cheap to try. 2 warnings before anybody orders one. Clonking is banned outright in some European countries and restricted in others, which tells you regulators consider it effective enough to legislate. And in the United States, rules on sound producing and electronic attracting devices differ by state and sometimes by individual body of water. Read your regulations before you use one. That is not a disclaimer. That is the difference between a good night and a citation. Number 2. The rattle. And here is where I keep the promise I made at the start. Of all 15 sounds on this list, this is the only one with a price tag. Rattle beads, rattling floats, sound-producing catfish rigs. $30 gets you a nice one. It is also, by a wide margin, the least supported item here. I am not saying it does not work. There are careful, experienced catfish anglers running rattles on blues and channels who are convinced. What I am saying is that everything else on this list rests on published measurement, and this one rests on testimonials from people who sell it and people who bought it. Notice the pattern. The 14 free items have real data behind them and no marketing. The one item with marketing behind it has the least data. That is not a conspiracy. That is just what happens when the only ideas that get an advertising budget are the ones that fit inside a blister pack. If you want to test it properly. 2 identical rods, identical bait, set the same distance apart. Rattle on one, nothing on the other. Swap which rod carries the rattle every hour, so you are testing the rattle and not the spot. 20 nights of that and you will know more than the packaging does. And number 1. The one that costs nothing and beats everything. Arrive and then do nothing. Every angler has an arrival ritual, and almost all of it is noise. Motor off, anchor down, chair out, cooler open, rod holders in, lid slammed, weight dropped. 6 minutes of the loudest sounds you will make all night, delivered directly on top of the fish, and then we sit down and wonder why the first hour is slow. Turn it around. Set your anchor upcurrent of the target so the noise lands away from it. Get every loud task done in the first 3 minutes, all in one block, instead of trickling noise out over half an hour. Then sit still for 20 minutes before your first bait goes in. There is a second half to this that almost nobody does, and it is the reason I started thinking about any of this. Listen to the spot before you fish it. Every piece of water has a noise floor. A bridge with truck traffic, a marina, a generator on the far bank, a dam letting water go. That background level decides how far your fish can hear anything at all, because masking is not about how loud you are, it is about how loud you are compared to everything else. 2 consequences fall straight out of that. First, on a loud stretch of water your discipline matters less, because the room is already full. On a quiet backwater at 2 in the morning, your discipline is worth more than your bait. Second, the noise floor drops at night. Road traffic thins. Recreational boats go home. That quiet window is not just when the catfish move shallow to feed. It is also the window in which they can hear the furthest, in the warmest water of the year, with their hearing sitting at the sharpest point on the temperature curve. That is the whole video in one sentence. In August, the fish are hungrier, the water is warmer, their hearing is better than at any other time of year, and the room around them just went quiet, which means every mistake on this list costs you more in August than in any other month, and every bit of restraint pays more. So let me say the uncomfortable part plainly. There is an entire industry built on the idea that the missing piece is something you have not bought yet. A stronger scent, a sharper hook, a better rod. Some of that is true, and I use plenty of it. But the 15 things on this list are almost entirely free, and that is exactly why you have never been sold them. Foam tape does not have a marketing budget. A bath mat on the deck does not get a pro staff. Sitting still for 20 minutes cannot be patented, cannot be bottled, and cannot be re-released next season in a new color. The one thing on this list you can buy is the one thing nobody has properly tested. 2 things before you go. Check your state and local regulations. Sound devices, chumming, bait rules, and possession limits all vary by state and often by individual water, and none of what I have described is worth a ticket. And in this heat, a fish that comes in tired. Warm water holds less oxygen, and a played-out catfish does not recover the way it does in October. Keep what you will eat, get the rest back fast, and support big fish horizontally. Now argue with me. I said your voice is mostly bouncing off the surface, and your cooler lid is the real thief. That contradicts what almost everyone on the bank believes. If you think I have it backwards, say so, and say why. And if you have ever run a clonk on American water, I want the honest version. Did it actually call fish, or was that the night you also happened to be on fresh bait? I read all of them,